introduce our next speaker, Benn Steil, I was reminded watching Paul that Paul and Judy and myself and other people were in Monterey once together, of course, talking about exactly these same issues, and Paul hasn't changed very much. I think what he was saying down in Monterey was more or less what he just said in this interview. At any rate, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Benn Steil. I've admired Ben for many years. He's a great scholar, and as well as a person with his feet on the ground and actually knows what's going on in markets and so forth, and that's why I think a lot of his scholarly work is so powerful. Ben is a senior fellow and director of international economics at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York. His most recent book is The Battle of Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and the Making of a New World Order. And he has a long string of books, but my favorite book, Ben, is the one you wrote with Manuel Hines. That probably doesn't surprise you. It's a great book, Money, Markets, and Sovereignty, which I highly recommend. Yeah, that's Yale, isn't it? Yale University Press. At any rate, I'm looking forward to listening to you, Ben. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you to the Kemp Foundation for having me. It's a real honor to be here. Bretton Woods is a story I decided I wanted to try to tell back in 2009 as the financial crisis was spreading globally, and you had world leaders from French President Nicolas Sarkozy to British Prime Minister Gordon Brown all calling for quote-unquote a new Bretton Woods. I thought it might be a good time to take a look at the old original one, and I was rather surprised to see that there had been very little written about it. Of course, Steve, we all learn as economists that if you see $20 on the ground, you're delusional because somebody would have picked it up by now. But there was, in fact, $20 on the ground. Nobody had picked it up before, and I was privileged to have picked it up because it turned out to be a far more fascinating story than I had ever realized. So let me give you the historical setting. We'll talk a little about the event and its significance, and then I'll move on to more contemporary themes. So the Bretton Woods International Monetary Conference of 1944. This is the most important international gathering since the Paris Peace Talks 25 years earlier in 1919. There are over 700 delegates from 44 allied nations. They begin their deliberations just 3 weeks after the D-Day landings at Normandy. So there's a real sort of sense of cautious optimism in the air that the beginnings of the end of the war have arrived so that the deliberations had real meaning. President Roosevelt believed that the event had enormous political significance. He believed it could bring the war to an earlier conclusion by demonstrating to the enemy Axis powers that it was the Allies and the United States in particular that had the compelling vision for the post-war order. Now, Roosevelt himself was no particular friend of international exchange rate stability. He, in fact, blew up an earlier conference in 1933, the London Economic Conference, by referring to exchange rate stability as, quote-unquote, a fetish of international bankers. But he left the detail of the event to his deputy, Henry Morgenthau. Morgenthau's chief qualification for the position of Treasury Secretary was that he was an old friend of FDR's from Hyde Park. He knew nothing about economics. He referred to himself as an apple farmer. He was a gentleman apple farmer, but an apple farmer nonetheless. Rather wry, prominent Democratic donor upon hearing that Henry Morgenthau had been made Treasury Secretary remarked that FDR had managed to, quote unquote, find the only Jew in America who knows nothing about money. Now, since she was Jewish, she could get away with it. So Morgenthau, not the sharpest tack in the box, relied on his deputy, Harry Dexter White, who was in fact an economist with a PhD from Harvard, to craft the details of the event, and he went well beyond the economics in organizing Bretton Woods, and I'll certainly talk a little about that. White, to my mind, is one of the most fascinating political figures in 20th century American history who nobody knows anything about, and we'll get to a little more on that further on. But basically, White and Morgenthau could be seen as economic determinists in their story about how we arrived at Bretton Woods. In their narrative, it was Britain's exit from the gold exchange standard in 1931 that set off the currency and trade wars in the early 1930s, that spread the Great Depression globally, and that created the environment of misery and anger that paved the path to aggression for Hitler and Mussolini. So their primary ambition at Bretton Woods was to stamp out what Henry Morgenthau called economic aggression through a new managed international monetary system based on fixed but adjustable exchange rates with the US dollar as its foundation. Now, gold would be a foundation underlying the US dollar, but I have to emphasize this very strongly. This is not your great-grandfather's classical gold standard. Harry Dexter White had no intention whatsoever of conducting monetary policy according to flows of gold across border. He was just very pleased that the U.S. happened to have a lot of it. By the time we get to 1944, the U.S. controls about 2/3 of the world's monetary gold stock, so most of these other countries are simply there to find out what the U.S. is going to do about a problem that they believe the U.S. had itself created. More about that momentarily. Now, there was another agenda at Bretton Woods, left largely unstated. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously referred to American Lend-Lease aid during World War II as, quote unquote, the most unsorted act. But he was well aware that it came with very painful geopolitical conditions that were attached by the U.S. Treasury, Harry Dexter White in particular, and these had three primary components. First, after the war, Britain would have to eliminate so-called imperial trade preference. This was the arrangement by which Britain gave itself privileged access to the markets of its colonies and its dominions. This was anathema both economically and politically to the Roosevelt administration. They would second have to make the pound sterling once again fully convertible into US dollars at a fixed exchange rate, a very overvalued exchange rate. The date that was ultimately set was June 15th, 1947. For Britain, a day that would live in infamy because it marked their formal bankruptcy. And in fact, you can see the empire collapsing over the course of about 3 weeks in February of 1947. India, Burma, Palestine, Greece, as Britain is running out of dollars and gold. Its colonies and dominions are queuing up, waiting for July 15th, 1947, to hand in their worthless sterling for dollars, and Britain decides it can no longer afford an empire. And they hand the keys to the kingdom to their primary creditor, the United States. We embark on the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan to basically fill the gap that Britain's imperial collapse left. But that's my next book, which is on the Marshall Plan. So wait for that one, and hopefully Jimmy will invite me back to talk about it. And finally, third condition, that Britain would essentially accept the US dollar as the international unit of account at Bretton Woods. And this was an initiative that the British, John Maynard Keynes in particular, fiercely resisted for many years in the run-up to Bretton Woods. And in fact, Harry Dexter White used some remarkable ruses in order to push this through at Bretton Woods. Now, these two aims, establishing a new international monetary system based on the dollar that would stop competitive devaluations, and creating this new world order with Britain eliminated as a geopolitical rival, would come together at Bretton Woods. The nicest way to see this is a quote from Harry Dexter White talking to the U.S. Delegation at Bretton Woods. These are mostly politicians. These are not people schooled in the monetary arts, explaining to them why the U.S. is in the position it is. And he says it's gold in Fort Knox that explains why the U.S. was, quote unquote, in such a powerful position at this conference. It is why we dominate the financial world. If only England was in this position, it would be a very different story. Harry Dexter White is a man who is quite literally obsessed with the relative geopolitical positions of the U.S. and Britain. This goes back a long way. I found a fascinating memo in his archives going back to 1936, at which point he's nothing more than a bureaucratic temp at the U.S. Treasury. And he writes in this memo to himself, the more sterling countries there are, the more countries that use the pound sterling, are pegged to the pound sterling, the stronger will be England's position around a conference table should an international conference take place. So 8 years before Bretton Woods, Harry Dexter White is already planning an international monetary conference at which he will best the British Empire. Very ambitious man. Henry Morgenthau explaining to President Truman after FDR died what it is he set out to do at Bretton Woods. He said, I wanted, quote unquote, to move the financial center of the world from London and Wall Street to the United States Treasury. Note the and Wall Street part. This is very much an anti-banker agenda as well as an anti-British and anti-colonial agenda. So why did the British ultimately sign up to this? Well, as a British delegate and famous economist in his own right, Lionel Robbins, commented at Bretton Woods, quote unquote, we needed the cash. And they did need the cash. A little bit about the two main personalities at Bretton Woods. First, John Maynard Keynes, who headed the British delegation. Keynes at Bretton Woods really created the role we're now all very familiar with today of international celebrity economist. We're all very familiar with characters like Paul Krugman and Nouriel Roubini who jet around the world with the media waiting on their every pronouncement, but it's Keynes at Bretton Woods who really created this role. He was a media phenomenon. The U.S. media was absolutely waiting on his every word. Although they didn't particularly like him and his ideas, they compared the quality of the U.S. delegation very unfavorably to the quality of the British delegation. This, of course, infuriated Henry Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White. In fact, Henry Morgenthau refused to let Keynes nominate him, Morgenthau, as president of the conference at the opening ceremonies because he didn't want Keynes to get anywhere near a microphone. Now, Keynes very well understood what the American agenda was. Here's Keynes explaining to his government back in 1942 what the heck is going on here. He said, we need to guard against the present emergency being used as an opportunity for picking out the eyes of the British Empire and to prevent, quote unquote, Britain becoming a satellite of the United States. He said there were quarters in the United States intending to use the grant of post-war credits as an opportunity for imposing the American conception of the international economic system. Now, even though he was a very perspicacious negotiator, he knew what was going on, he was in many senses the world's worst diplomat. He was far more concerned with logically cornering and humiliating his opponents than he was with converting them, which is not a good strategy when you're bankrupt. And Harry Dexter White, for all his limitations, represented a country that was not bankrupt. And this produced enormous problems for Keynes and the British. Also, he had one quality that I think no diplomat should ever have going into a negotiation. That is, he had a personal vested interest in the outcome. He wanted to be known as the man who overthrew the wretched gold standard and replaced it with a new, rational, managed international monetary system in which the enlightened technocrats of the future would manage international monetary affairs. Now, he was not naive. He knew in the first instance it would be Harry Dexter White's system, not his own system, that would be chosen, but he thought the world would soon enough see sense and adopt his system. Probably didn't come as soon as he would have liked, but many of you may remember back in 2009, the PBOC Governor Joe made a very famous statement in which he suggested that Bretton Woods may have been a horrible mistake and we should never have pursued the White Plan. We should have pursued the Keynes Plan and introduced a new international currency that could have supplanted the US dollar and avoided so many of problems which the dollar-based system had created. I'm sure Keynes would have appreciated this, but wished that this had come out a little bit earlier. His bust-ups with Harry Dexter White over the years of negotiations before the conference were absolutely legendary. Part of this was based on the backgrounds of the two men. Keynes was the son of upper middle-class Cambridge academics. He was raised by a governess and servants. He was expected to go on to great things in life, which of course he did. Harry Dexter White was the youngest of 7 children of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants in working-class Boston. His father was a hardware peddler. He dropped out of school in his first attempt to get a degree in order to go back into the family hardware business. And when these men come together, there's a sort of social mismatch, and White's very sensitive to this. He used to get physically sick before going into negotiations with Keynes because he didn't want to be humiliated in front of his colleagues. My favorite exchange between the two comes in October 1943. Keynes takes the most recent version of the White Plan for Bretton Woods, throws it on the ground and yells, "This is intolerable. It is yet another Talmud." Talmud, of course, being a reference to the fact that White was Jewish. And White responds in kind. He says, "Well, we will try to produce something which your highness can understand." So, these two men. So these are the main characters at Bretton Woods. 95% of the agreement is already fixed before we get to the conference. The parts that weren't fixed, White left to the conference itself. You'll have to read the book to find out about the various ruses, because I'm going to get kicked off the stage if I talk too much. But let me just emphasize the basic differences between the White Plan and Keynes' plan for Bretton Woods. White wanted to create a new international monetary system based firmly on the US dollar. The US dollar would be important, White said, because of the fact that the US controlled so much of the monetary gold stock. He argued that if the dollar were ever to fail to be credibly backed by gold, no one in the world would have any confidence in it and would fail to play this role as an international unit of account. Keynes wanted to supplant the US dollar by creating a new international reserve currency, which he called Bancor. White wanted to make it very difficult for countries to devalue. He wanted them to get permission from the new International Monetary Fund that he was going to establish. Keynes wanted countries to devalue or revalue according to a preset formula. White wanted the IMF to look very much like it does now, a powerful interventionist institution with a large staff of expert technocratic economists. This wouldn't be a threat to the United States because the way White designed the voting system, only the United States would have a veto. And he made very clear to Congress that if the IMF were ever to do anything that it didn't like, it could take the report and throw it in the trash. Keynes wanted the IMF to be passive, not so much an institution as a mechanism, sort of like an ATM for debtor countries. He very much resisted the idea that it should have any sort of large staff, that the executive directors should be any more than part-timers who just fly in for the board meetings and then go home. White was quite insistent, although he held this back from Keynes at Bretton Woods to try to prevent one of Keynes's famous explosions, that both the IMF and the World Bank would be based in Washington. Keynes had this charming vision of the world being divided between London. London would control half the world through the International Monetary Fund from its base, and the United States would control the other half of the world out of New York, not Washington, because Washington had too much political significance. When Keynes eventually found out in March of '46 that it was going to be DC, he was absolutely apoplectic. Perhaps the most interesting part of the story is how the head of the IMF was chosen. That was not discussed at Bretton Woods. Many of you might be curious as to how it is, given that the IMF is so much more important than the World Bank. White didn't give a damn about the World Bank. He put Keynes in charge of the commission to produce the World Bank at Bretton Woods to keep him away from the main event, which was creating the IMF and the new dollar-based international monetary system. So here's the story as to how the Europeans managed to take the permanent, almost, at least to date, head of the IMF. How did they manage this? Well, in January of '46, President Truman nominates Harry Dexter White to be the first U.S. executive director of the fund, and he's going to nominate him to be the first managing director, the head of the fund. But as soon as this man, anybody recognize him? Gets wind of it, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, he sends a long memo to the president saying, don't even think of it. I can prove that he, Harry Dexter White, is in fact a Soviet agent. Now, Truman doesn't believe Hoover, but he knows that he's got a huge political problem on his hands because if he goes forward with the nomination, Hoover will leak it, and this will create terrible political problems for him. His cabinet, in particular the Treasury Secretary and Secretary of State, want him out of government entirely. They hate Harry Dexter White, but Truman is a political maneuverer. He says, no, 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 I can quarantine him as U.S. Executive Director. That nomination had already gone through a Senate committee. We'll leave him as U.S. Executive Director. I just won't nominate him to be the Managing Director. Still creates a problem that if you nominate another American to sit above Harry Dexter White, it's going to raise questions about why the architect of the institution has been passed over, and he doesn't want to answer those questions. So the U.S. concocts a new narrative in March of '46 that they take to the British. Keynes is absolutely shocked that the U.S. decided after due deliberation that in order to secure the confidence of the U.S. investment community, they wanted presidency of the World Bank, and it would be ungracious of the United States to take both institutions. So a Belgian was appointed head of the IMF, and the tradition has survived ever since that a European would head the IMF and an American the World Bank. Now, let me talk a bit about Bretton Woods itself and what it didn't do. We all learn at school that the Bretton Woods era, the 25 years from '46 to '71 when Nixon closed the gold window, was a golden era for international growth, international trade, cooperation. But in fact, almost none of this has anything to do with Bretton Woods. The IMF was moribund throughout most of the '40s and '50s. Nobody wanted to borrow from the institution. They were already bankrupt. They preferred to keep their currencies in convertible, and they preferred to keep up barriers to trade. Those barriers to trade and the sort of training wheels for convertibility were actually produced through the Marshall Plan, and in particular one component of the Marshall Plan, the European Payments Union, which lasted from 1950 to 1958. It was underwritten by U.S. Marshall Aid. In current dollars, about $3 billion of Marshall Aid went to underpin the European Payments Union. It wasn't, in fact, till 1961 that the first 9 European countries met the IMF convertibility requirements in the Articles of Agreement. By that time, the system was already beginning to break down as the U.S. was losing gold reserves. And of course, in 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, the system was wrapped up entirely. But the point I want to emphasize is that the system never worked as it had been intended. Having said that, after 1971, the world proved that Harry Dexter White was wrong. A fiat dollar could form the foundation of an international monetary system, but that's not to say it doesn't have problems. One of its problems, and that's one I want to emphasize, is that it's created a sort of fiat dollar version of the Triffin dilemma. That is, the United States is pretty much obliged to run persistent current account deficits in order to supply the world with the dollars that it demands. This over time produces global imbalances, which can get out of hand. And in certain instances of instant shock, these imbalances get reversed with catastrophic effects, in particular for emerging markets. The most interesting case study, I believe, is that of Ukraine. Ukraine, back in April 2013, the Yanukovych government walks out of discussions with the IMF over a $15 billion bailout package. They reject the IMF's terms for liberalizing their energy market. They decide they're going to muddle through by borrowing money internationally. They issue a 10-year, $1.25 billion euro bond at 7.5% interest. Everything is going along swimmingly until May 22nd, 1943, when Ben Bernanke makes his famous taper speech. And what happens is that the yield on 10-year Ukrainian bonds soars to over 11%. Here I have the data for 7-year bonds, because that's where Bloomberg's data were best, but you can see the same effect. Immediately, the yield on Ukrainian sovereign debt soars. It stays at that level until December, when Russia offers a bailout package in exchange for Ukraine abandoning its association agreement with the EU. Ukrainians, as we know, took to the streets. Yanukovych is overthrown, and the rest is history. What's fascinating is that the taper didn't actually begin until January 2014, when markets were much calmer. I would argue that if Ben Bernanke, with hindsight, had kept his mouth shut and just began the taper in January of 2014, Yanukovych might still be in power today, and we wouldn't have the Ukrainian crisis. That's speculation, it's counterfactual history, but it just indicates how powerful the Federal Reserve is in a fiat-based international monetary system based on the US dollar. Now, of course, many other countries were affected, not just Ukraine, but it wasn't random. As you see here, the chart on the left, there's a very strong positive correlation between depreciation after the famous taper speech and current account deficits. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner, South Korea, which was running a very large current account surplus, actually saw its currency appreciate between May and September, when the Federal Reserve formally abandoned its idea to begin the taper. And the interesting point to make about that is that the IMF did a fascinating study that they published in the fall of 2013, in which they examined the countries that had performed best during the period of unconventional monetary policy in the United States. And they said that these countries had three features. One, they were running large current account surpluses. Two, they had large dollar foreign exchange reserves, and three, they had a low level of foreign ownership of domestic assets. Essentially, they all look like South Korea. The big problem in this is that if you look at those three features, this is pretty much the US Congress's definition of currency manipulation. So when emerging markets do exactly what the IMF has documented to be the prudent thing to do to insulate yourself from macroeconomic shocks, they contribute to global imbalances. They produce political turmoil in the United States, and to some extent, this featured into the election of Donald Trump. So this is very much, in my view, a fissure in the international monetary system that comes from having a fiat dollar-based foundation. Now, there have been many attempts to address this particular problem. One which I think has by far the most promise politically is for countries to pool their reserves. And the fact in this regard, the most significant such attempt has been the Chiang Mai initiative in Asia, which was established after the Asian crisis. In theory, the countries that participate have access to a pool of $250 billion of combined reserves to tap into. Having said that, the likely creditors in the system don't trust the likely debtors, and so they impose a very strict caveat. You can't actually tap more than 30% of your quota without being on an IMF program. And if you got to be on an IMF program, you might as well go to the IMF. The BRICS Bank, this initiative a few years ago, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has the same exact flaw. If you look on the left, you'll see that in a crisis, Brazil India, Russia cannot actually call on more than $5.4 billion out of the BRICS Bank Contingent Reserve Arrangement. No one would rationally draw on that $5 billion because you will not prevent a crisis, you will precipitate a crisis. $5 billion is not nearly enough to prevent a crisis, but it's more than enough to signal to the market that a crisis is in fact coming. And so if you compare that $5 billion to IMF disbursements to crisis-hit countries like Brazil, 2002, 2003, borrowed $38 billion, Russia in the 1990s, over $30 billion, and that was a time when international capital flows were a pitiful fraction of what they are today. You can see that initiatives like this, as a practical matter, because of politics, achieve absolutely nothing. So all of these countries, as you see, hold very, very significant foreign exchange reserves. They would not rely on a system like this. Now, just in closing, I would emphasize that Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the BRICS Bank initiatives and similar initiatives for helping to break down the dominance of the fiat US dollar over the international monetary system. Now, just to remind you, the BRICS Bank was set up to challenge the World Bank. So let's look at Vladimir Putin's thesis. If you look at the total subscribed capital for the World Bank, only 10% of it is in US dollars. Would anybody like to guess what percentage of the $50 billion in subscribed capital of the BRICS Bank is denominated in US dollars? 100%. So the BRICS Bank initiative has added a new source of global demand for US dollar denominated assets, and in fact has contributed to further dependence on a fiat US dollar. So I would just say in closing that all of this, I think, goes to illustrate that it is perhaps as easy to criticize the fiat dollar-based international monetary system as it is challenging politically to improve on it. Thank you very much.